Hello, and welcome to this video on the SSL SiX. First, I want to let you know I'll be breaking this video down into different parts. If I'm talking about something you may already know, please check the description. I'll leave timestamps on different topics. The first thing I'm going to go over is the inputs on the SSL SiX. Now, you may be wondering, why is it called the SiX when there are only 4 faders besides the main mix bus? There's only 4 faders on the board. Well, simply the stereo inputs count as 3, 4, 5, 6. Besides those 6, we also have more inputs, a TALKBACK input, an external input, and also the inputs from the DSUB connector. But before we get into any of that, I just want to focus on the mono and the stereo inputs. Up at the top of our mono channel strip, we can notice that there is a XLR input and a line input. There are a few buttons too. A 48 volts, which will send phantom power through for a condenser microphone, a high pass filter, which will cut the low end of the signal, a line button, which will tell the input to switch to line, and a high Z button. Let me first explain what the line button is for. By default, the XLR is going to be going straight to the gain knob. If you want to switch to the line input, if you're recording, let's say, a guitar, you're going to want to hit line, because it'll then switch the signal. You might be wondering what the high Z button is for. Simply, it changes the impedance of the line. It does not affect the XLR. When you are plugging in a guitar cable, because the inputs on the SSL SiX are all balanced, a guitar cable has an unbalanced cable because it's just tip sleeve. The high Z switch changes the impedance on the input to match that of the guitar cable. Next, I want to go down and talk about the gain. The gain knob just sounds so good, really at any level. It has this great colorful distortion, and then it also gets super clean. Besides our gain knob, we have the compressor. It's cool because it's a one knob compressor. So what could this one knob actually be doing? Essentially, you are just controlling the threshold with this knob. And if it's all the way to the right, it's at max compression at minus 20 dB, which is be the threshold. And then all the way to the left would be 10 dB. It is a 2-to-1 ratio with a 300 millisecond release and a 8 millisecond to 30 millisecond attack, depending on where the threshold is set. Right below our compressor, we have our EQ, and it's also a very simplified EQ. There's only 2 knobs here, a pink knob which controls all the high frequencies, and a black knob that controls all the low frequencies. And by default, these knobs act as shelves. The high frequency knob acts at around 10K, while the low frequency knob acts at around 60 Hz. What a shelf is used for is for boosting or attenuating the really high highs or the really low lows. If you're used to using an EQ on a recording software, you're probably used to using bell curves, and this console does have a bell curve switch just to the side of the knob. When the bell button is engaged, the low frequency is going to focus around 200 Hz and the high frequency is going to focus around 5 kHz. Alright, and it's hard not to bump into this, but below the EQ and to the side of EQ, we have 2 stereo sends. So you might be saying to yourself, I don't really know what a stereo Q send even is. What does it do? What is it for? Essentially, it is used on recording consoles to send out a signal either to an artist's headphone mix or a time-based effect like a reverb. Because I don't want to get too in-depth and I'm going to explain more about it later, I'm going to move on to the next part of the channel strip. Now, below the stereo Q2 and almost diagonal to the left of the stereo Q1, we have our pan knob. And the pan knob is basically going to control the pan pot positioning of this signal to the main mix bus or to the bus B. Right below stereo Q1, on the right side of the fader, we have an insert button. The insert button is used if you want to insert a signal processing effect such as an outboard compressor. The only way you can use the insert button is via the DSUB connector on the back. Next, and to the left of the insert, we have our fader, which essentially just controls the level to the main mix bus. Below, we have our bus B. Because it can be a little confusing at first, like our Q sends, I'm going to save it for later. However, just know all it does is it mutes the signal from the main mix bus and sends it to a different mix bus out the back of the console. Finally, below the bus B, we have the pre-fade listen. This allows you to hear what the signal sounds like before it gets to the fader. Because the other mono channel is completely identical to the first mono channel, I'm going to skip over it and get into the stereo channels, which are also identical. Upon first glance, it's a lot more simple. You just have stereo inputs left and right, 3 and 4 on the very top. You have a gain knob. You have stereo Q2 on the top, a pan knob, stereo Q1 right below it, and a fader, and then the same thing as before, a bus B and pre-fade listen switch. Now, what's cool is if you have just a mono signal that you want to plug in here, any of the stereo inputs on the SSL SiX, if you plug in just to the left, it becomes a mono signal for the whole thing. To the very top right of the console, we will see our TALKBACK input. It has a gain knob to the bottom left of it, right next to the G series bus compressor. In the TALKBACK input section, there is a 48 volts for condenser microphone, and there is also a LMC switch, which is essentially just a compressor that is used to hear everyone in the room at once. It can also be used on drums for this crunchy, grindy 80s sound. Besides our TALKBACK input, we have our external inputs. There are 2 stereo inputs, and they each have their own volume knob in the monitoring source section. If you want to hear these in the artist's headphones or the monitors, you have to engage the switches that are in the monitoring source section. However, if you want to add them to the main mix bus coming out of the channel line outputs on the back, you have to click the external 1 and 2 buttons. It might seem a little confusing, but I will definitely explain more later in this video. And our final set of inputs are our DSUB inputs, which are located in the back of the console. What a DSUB connector is several XLR cables all going into the tip of one connector, and this connector has several different inputs on the console. The DSUB inputs for the SiX go as the following. The first 2 channels are the main left and right insert return. This can be seen above the main mix bus fader. The third and the fourth DSUB inputs are the channel 1 insert return and the channel 2 insert return. The final 2 are the channel 1 and channel 2 alternative inputs. In this next part of the video, I'm going to be talking about the routing capabilities with the SSL SiX. Let's start with how we're going to sum 12 inputs to the main mix bus. If we're just going to use our mono channel 1 and 2 and both of our stereo channels 3, 4, 5, 6, that would be 6 inputs all directly going to the main mix bus. Now, if we want to add 4 more inputs, we're going to use our external inputs. The way you do this is by using the monitor source section. In the monitor source section, instead of letting one input take the priority, it lets you sum together all the inputs you have on the console. So, we can sum together the main mix bus with external 1 and external 2 inputs. Now, that is going to be coming out of our monitor outputs. If we wanted to get it to come out of our channel line outputs on the back of the console, we also need to click the buttons external 1 and external 2 above the main mix bus fader. So far, we have inputs from our mono and stereo channels 1 through 6 and 4 additional inputs from our external inputs. The last two inputs we can get via the DSUB connector. These are the alternative inputs that I introduced earlier. To add these alternative inputs to the main mix bus, all we have to do is look at our mono channels and find our stereo Q1. In stereo Q1, there will be an on switch and an alt switch. They both need to be pressed down in order to send an alternative input to the main mix bus. A nice feature at this point is that we can use the stereo Q level as the input's mix level and even use the pan position for it in the mix. Now I'll talk about the bus B and give you an example of how we can use it. The idea of using bus B is so you can monitor and record at the same time. The first example of bus B is how I'm recording my voice right now. It's going in on mono channel 1, I'm using the compressor and the EQ, and then I'm sending it out bus B. Now, I can hear myself talking too, but that's because the computer's output is going into the stereo 5 and 6, which I will not send on bus B because that would create a feedback loop. Now, before I show you a recording trick that I use with bus B, I want to show you the volume knob and then the summing capability with bus B. If we look in our monitoring source section, we'll see that there is a black knob with a mute switch that says bus B under it. Now, we can turn up the output coming from the back of the console with this black knob. I will turn it up as much as I can right now and see what happens. There we go. It's gotten really loud. And then I'm going to use the mute until my voice comes back. Before, when I was sharing the summing capabilities, I showed how we can sum together the stereo and mono inputs with the external inputs. We could also do this with the bus B if we would like to hear it from our monitoring source section. What we do is click the bus B right above the words monitoring source. This will then add it to our main mix bus. The last thing I want to share with bus B is a recording trick I figured out. When we take a look at the output of bus B on the back of the console, we'll notice that it's stereo. Essentially, this method has us sending one of our mono channels out the left side and the other mono channel out the right side of those two stereo cables. So if the two mono tracks that we are sending out bus B are hard panned left and then the other one's hard panned right, we're going to have two separate mono inputs on our interface. I found that solution because often when you record with bus B, you'll be forced to use a stereo input on your DAW. This method allows you to record two mono channels at once, say if you had a stereo guitar setup. Okay, and thanks for sticking with me this far. Now we're going to go into the stereo Q sends and how they work hand in hand with their outputs, the foldback outputs. Essentially, stereo Q1 is going to go out foldback 1, and stereo Q2 is going to go out foldback 2. There is a foldback section on the mixer where we control exactly what is coming out of the foldbacks. Without touching any buttons in the foldback section, the default signal going to the outputs of the foldback section will be the stereo Q's pre-fade. Pre-fade just means that the fader on any of the channels does not affect the signal level that is going to the foldback outputs. That's pre-fade. In our foldback section, there is a Q post button that will switch it to post-fade. This means that the level that's coming out the foldback output directly correlates to the level of the fader on that channel. Okay, and before I delve deeper into the foldback section, I want to point out that there's two knobs there. These knobs control the output level of each foldback. The way the foldback section works is instead of summing together, it stacks. Whatever is the bottommost button will take priority to the foldback outputs. You'll notice that the talk button is on the very bottom. If an artist is listening and they want to hear you talk to them, well, you would just click the talk button and it would interrupt the music coming into their headphones from the stereo cues. When you finish talking to them, you just unclick the button. To get a good understanding of how the foldback section works, you just want to know that you can send more than just the stereo cues out of the foldback outputs. You can send the external inputs out of them, or you can send the TALKBACK input out of the foldbacks. So if we're going to use the TALKBACK input to send out of the foldbacks, it allows us to have a third XLR microphone to record with. I want to go back and tell you that the foldback outputs are default to the stereo cue sends. The whole point of using the foldback section is to send different inputs besides the stereo cues out of the foldbacks. Let me use another example of a recording session where the artist is listening to all the stereo cues on channels 1 through 6, and then you want to talk to them, and then you also want to share the demo that they sent you and that you're trying to recreate. So the first thing you'll do is talk to the artist. All you do in the foldback section is click the talk button. When you say, I'm going to send the demo in through your headphones, you're going to unclick the talk button and then click external 1. It could be external 2, whichever one you have the demo coming into. As the artist listens to the demo, you and the producer in the control room want to hear it as well. In the monitoring source section, you'll click external 1 to sum the demo into the monitors. When the demo is finished, the artist asks you to add more reverb to their voice. I'm going to show you how to do this with the additional stereo cue send and foldback output. So far, the channels we are using are mono channel 1 to record the vocals, stereo 5 and 6 to hear the playback, and external input 1 to listen to the demo tape. Okay, so I'm going to be using the second mono channel to place the reverb. Starting on the channel where our vocals are, mono channel 1, I'm going to use stereo cue 2 to send it out foldback output 2. Coming from the foldback output 2, I'm going to plug it into my reverb device and then out of my reverb device into the second mono channel. So when I record this, one of the mono channels is going out of the left-hand side of bus B, and the other mono track is going out the right-hand side of bus B. They're both going to be hard panned. This way, we have two separate mono inputs. So in that example, I showed you how we can use the stereo cue sends for a time-based effect or for an artist's headphone mix. We can also use the foldback section to talk to the artist with the talk button, or we can play an external input with the external input buttons. There's so many different ways you can use the foldback section. The way I'm going to use it and the way you're going to use it will be a lot different. As long as you know the functions of the system, then you can get a good idea and a creative mind going on what you want to do with it. Now the last thing I want to show you is the monitoring section and the main fader. Alright, if we focus our attention to the right hand side of the console, we'll see the main mix bus and the summing controls right above it. To the left, we can see our monitoring source section. Besides that, we can see our bus B controls and our headphone controls. On the very bottom of this section, we can see the monitor controls. Towards the very top, we can see our G-bus compressor. I'll save the best for last there. I want to start with a few things I've already introduced to you. Looking above the main mix bus fader, we can see all the summing capabilities. There's stereo cue 1 that we can add. There's external input 1 and 2. And then there's an insert button where we can insert a channel processor such as the SSL Fusion. Do note that we cannot insert stereo cue 2, only stereo cue 1. Also note everything that you're summing above the main mix bus fader is going out the channel line outputs on the back of the console. Now I'd like to talk about the monitor outputs and their controls on the console. Just like that we have two mix buses, the main and bus B, we also have two monitor outputs, the main monitor output and the alternative monitor output. Let's focus our attention on the monitor control section. We'll see that there is an alt switch, a mono switch, a cut switch, and a dim switch. There is also a volume knob right in the center. By default, this is the main monitor output section we see on the back of the console. When most studios want to reference their mix on smaller speakers, they'll hit the Alt button, and this will switch the monitor output to the Alt output. With the mono switch, we can turn both the alt and the main output into a mono signal. Directly below that, we have the cut switch. This acts as a mute button. To the side of that is the dim button. The purpose of the dim switch is to lower the overall volume coming out of the monitors so you could talk to someone in the control room. To control the level of attenuation by the dim switch, there is a black knob in the monitoring source section that says dim right below it. I also want to cover the additional knobs in the monitoring source section. We have the two on the very top for the external inputs. We have, besides that to the right, the bus B output level control, and on the very bottom right, we have our headphone output control. If you notice the L-shaped configuration of the monitoring source section, you see that we can sum with the following buttons: the external inputs, the main mix, and the bus B. In the headphone section, we can see that there is two buttons that allow us to hear the stereo Q1 or the stereo Q2. This is all pre-fade. And below that, we see the headphone output control. And now the best for last. The G-Series bus compressor is located below the TALKBACK input and above the FOLDBACK output. The in switch will engage the compressor to the main mix bus and the monitoring source section. The two parameters here are the threshold on the left and the makeup volume on the right. You'd use the makeup volume to match the level of the main mix bus. Unlike the mono channel strip compressor, the threshold on the G-Series bus compressor works in reverse. All the way to the right would be the highest threshold at 20 dB, and all the way to the left would be the lowest threshold at minus 20 dB. I hope this tutorial demonstrated a couple of things that you wanted to learn about the SSL SiX. There's so many different ways you can use this board in a creative aspect. I can't fit them all into one video, but we can fit it into one comment section. If you'd like to drop a comment on a fun way or cool thing that you're doing with the SSL SiX, please let us know. Now go have some fun with your SiX, and thank you for watching.